The frost crunched beneath Francis Moller's boots as he made his way through Willowbrook Cemetery on Christmas Eve, the bitter December wind cutting through his wool coat like glass. He'd come here every year for the past 3 years, carrying a small wreath to place on his wife's grave. But tonight, something was different. There, kneeling beside a weathered headstone 50 yards away, was a young girl no more than 12 years old, her long auburn hair spilling over a tattered red coat that had seen too many winters. What Francis couldn't have imagined was that following this mysterious child would lead him to uncover a decades-old conspiracy that had torn apart an entire family, cost multiple lives, and hidden a truth so devastating that it would shake the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about his quiet town of Millbrook Heights. By New Year's Day, this solitary man who had spent 3 years avoiding human connection would find himself in the middle of a fight for justice that would either save an innocent life or destroy his own. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. The girl he was watching wasn't just visiting any grave. She was visiting the final resting place of someone who was supposed to be very much alive, and the secret she carried would expose a web of lies that reached into the highest levels of local government, law enforcement, and the wealthy Pemberton family, who controlled half the businesses in town. Before we dive into this incredible journey, tell us where you're watching from tonight. And if this story moves you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have something truly extraordinary planned for you. Francis stood frozen behind a towering oak tree, watching as the girl carefully placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grave. Even from a distance, he could see her lips moving, as if she was having a conversation with whoever lay beneath that cold stone marker. The wind carried fragments of her whispered words. "I'm sorry, Mama. I tried to find help. They won't listen." Something about the scene felt profoundly wrong. What was a child doing alone in a cemetery at nearly midnight on Christmas Eve? Where were her parents, and why did she look so thin, so fragile, like a ghost herself wandering among the dead? Francis had been coming to this cemetery for 3 years, ever since his wife Evelyn had lost her battle with cancer. Those visits had become a ritual of grief, a way to feel connected to the woman he'd loved for 15 years. But tonight, as he watched this mysterious girl, his protective instincts as a father kicked in. His own daughter, Luna, was safe at home with his mother-in-law, probably fast asleep with visions of Christmas morning dancing in her head. This child had no one. The girl's ritual was meticulous and heartbreaking. She cleaned the headstone with a small cloth, arranged the flowers just so, and then sat cross-legged in the snow, seemingly oblivious to the cold that was making Francis's teeth chatter, even in his heavy winter coat. She reached into a small backpack and pulled out what looked like a journal, reading aloud in a voice too mature for her apparent age. Francis found himself stepping closer, drawn by a combination of concern and curiosity. As a social worker for the county's Child Protective Services, he'd seen too many children in dangerous situations. Every instinct told him this child needed help, but something held him back. Maybe it was the reverence in her posture, the way she spoke to the grave as if the person buried there could hear every word. This wasn't just a visit, it was a sacred communion between the living and the dead. As he moved to get a better view, Francis accidentally stepped on a fallen branch. The sharp crack echoed through the silent cemetery like a gunshot. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes scanning the darkness with the alertness of someone who had learned to always watch for danger. For a moment, their eyes met across the moonlit graveyard, and Francis felt his heart stop. Those weren't the eyes of a 12-year-old. They held a depth of pain and knowledge that belonged to someone who had seen and endured far too much. Dark circles rimmed her pale blue eyes, and her cheeks were hollow with hunger. But it was the fear in her expression that cut through Francis like a blade. This child was terrified, not just of being discovered, but of something much more sinister. The girl scrambled to her feet, clutching her backpack and journal to her chest. For a second, Francis thought she might run, but instead she did something unexpected. She pressed her finger to her lips in a gesture for silence, then pointed toward the cemetery entrance. Following her gaze, Francis saw the sweep of headlights cutting through the darkness. A black sedan was pulling slowly through the gates, its occupants clearly searching for something or someone. Without thinking, Francis stepped out from behind the tree and motioned for the girl to come toward him. She hesitated, torn between flight and the instinct to trust this stranger who had appeared in her moment of need. The headlights were getting closer, and Francis could hear the low rumble of the car's engine as it crept along the cemetery's main path. "This way," Francis whispered, extending his hand. "I can help you." The girl looked from Francis to the approaching car, weighing her options in the space of a heartbeat. Then she made her choice. She darted toward him, light as a shadow, and Francis felt her small, cold hand slip into his. Together they moved deeper into the cemetery, using the larger monuments and mausoleums as cover. As they crouched behind an elaborate Victorian tomb, Francis got his first close look at the child who would change his life forever. She couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds, and her clothes, while clean, were clearly second-hand and insufficient for the bitter cold. But it was her face that broke his heart. Beautiful and ethereal, but marked by a weariness that spoke of experiences no child should ever endure. "What's your name?" Francis whispered, as the car's headlights swept past their hiding spot. "Autumn," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Autumn Rivers." The name hit Francis like a physical blow. He knew that name. Every social worker in the county knew that name. Autumn Rivers had been the subject of a massive search effort 2 years ago, when she'd allegedly been kidnapped from her foster home by her mentally unstable biological mother, Diane Rivers. The case had made headlines for weeks before the trail went cold. Diane Rivers had been found dead in a car accident 3 months later, and it was assumed that Autumn had died with her, though her body was never recovered. But here she was, very much alive, hiding in a cemetery on Christmas Eve, and apparently in danger from whoever was hunting her in that black sedan. "Autumn," Francis said carefully, "people have been looking for you for a very long time." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I know, but the people looking for me aren't the good guys, Mr. Francis Moller, and I am one of the good guys." Autumn studied his face in the moonlight, and Francis had the strange sensation of being evaluated by someone far older and wiser than her apparent years. Finally, she nodded. "I know who you are. You work for the county. You helped my friend Jenny Martinez when her stepfather was hurting her." Francis was stunned. How could this child know about his cases? How long had she been watching, observing, staying hidden in plain sight? The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the cemetery, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Whoever was in that sedan had gotten out and was conducting a ground search. Francis felt Autumn tense beside him, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "They can't find me," she whispered, her voice filled with a terror that chilled Francis to the bone. "If they find me, they'll kill me, just like they killed Mama." As the footsteps grew closer and Francis heard the low murmur of voices coordinating their search, he realized that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous and complex than a simple case of a missing child. This wasn't a rescue scenario. This was a race for survival, and somehow this brave little girl held the key to a secret that people were willing to kill to protect. The cemetery that had been Francis's place of quiet grief and remembrance had become the setting for a mystery that would test everything he believed about justice, courage, and the lengths one person would go to protect an innocent life. And as he looked into Autumn's frightened but determined eyes, Francis knew that his life of careful routine and emotional numbness was about to end forever. The hunt was on, and Christmas Eve had become the most dangerous night of their lives. 3 years earlier, Francis Moller had been a different man entirely. He'd wake each morning to the sound of Evelyn humming in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and pancakes drawing him downstairs to find his wife and 8-year-old daughter Luna planning their day together. Life had been predictable then, comfortable in the way that only comes from a marriage built on genuine friendship and shared dreams. Francis worked as a senior investigator for Millbrook Heights Child Protective Services, a job that had chosen him rather than the other way around. After growing up in the foster care system himself, he understood the particular vulnerability of children caught in bureaucratic limbo. His colleagues respected his instincts, his ability to see through the lies that adults told to protect themselves at children's expense. But everything had changed the day Dr. Harrison delivered Evelyn's diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe 8 if they were lucky with treatment. Francis had sat in that sterile office listening to medical terms that sounded like a foreign language, watching his wife's face crumble as their future dissolved into a series of chemotherapy appointments and hospital stays. The months that followed were a blur of desperate hope and gradual acceptance. Evelyn fought with everything she had, not for herself, but for Luna, who was too young to understand why Mommy was always tired, why she wore scarves instead of her beautiful auburn hair, why Daddy cried in the shower when he thought no one could hear.
Francis had taken leave from work during Evelyn's final weeks, spending every moment possible by her bedside. Luna would curl up between them in the hospital bed, reading Harry Potter aloud while Evelyn dozed, and Francis memorized the sound of his daughter's voice, knowing that soon it would be all he had left of their family's evening ritual. The night Evelyn died, Francis felt something inside himself shut down permanently. Not grief exactly, but the capacity for hope. He went through the motions of living, getting Luna to school, preparing meals, maintaining their small house on Maple Street, but it was all mechanical, a performance of normalcy for his daughter's sake. Returning to work had been a necessity rather than a choice. The life insurance money wouldn't last forever, and Luna needed stability. But Francis found himself struggling with cases that had never bothered him before. Seeing children separated from their families, even abusive ones, reminded him too acutely of his own loss. He began taking the late-night emergency calls, the weekend shifts, anything that kept him busy when Luna was with Evelyn's mother. Mrs. Catherine Whitfield, Evelyn's mother, had moved to Millbrook Heights after the funeral. Officially, she was there to help with Luna, but Francis knew she was really there to make sure he didn't fall apart completely. She was a retired school principal with the kind of no-nonsense wisdom that comes from managing children and bureaucracy for 30 years. "You're grieving, Francis," she'd told him 6 months after the funeral. "That's natural and necessary, but you're also hiding from life, and that's not fair to Luna. She needs to see her father living, not just surviving." Catherine was right, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things. Francis could function. He investigated cases, filed reports, testified in court when necessary, but the passion that had once driven his work was gone. He was going through the motions, and everyone could see it. His supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, had been patient but direct during his annual review. "Francis, your casework is still solid, but you've lost your edge. The families trust you, the kids respond to you, but you're not fighting for them the way you used to. What happens when you encounter a case that requires you to go beyond the minimum?" Francis knew she was right. He'd been coasting, taking the straightforward cases and leaving the complex investigations to younger, hungrier social workers. He told himself it was wisdom, letting others handle the politically sensitive situations, but it was really self-preservation. He couldn't afford to care too deeply about other people's children when caring had cost him so much. The Autumn Rivers case had been one of those complex investigations he'd avoided. When the 9-year-old girl disappeared from her foster home 2 years ago, supposedly taken by her mentally unstable mother, Francis had been assigned as the lead investigator. But something about the case had felt wrong from the beginning. The foster family, the Hendersons, had been too calm, too rehearsed in their account of what happened. They claimed Diane Rivers had broken into their home in the middle of the night, threatened them with a knife, and disappeared with autumn. But there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and neighbors reported seeing a black sedan in the area around the time of the alleged kidnapping, not the beat-up Honda Civic that Diane Rivers drove. Francis had pushed for a more thorough investigation, but pressure from above had shut him down quickly. The case was transferred to Detective Raymond Carlisle, a 20-year veteran of the Millbrook Heights Police Department, who seemed more interested in closing cases than solving them. Within a week, Carlisle had issued an Amber Alert and declared it a straightforward parental kidnapping. 3 months later, when Diane Rivers' car was pulled from Thornton Lake with her body inside, the case was quietly closed. Autumn Rivers was presumed dead, though her body was never found. The official story was that Diane, overwhelmed with guilt and mental illness, had driven herself and her daughter into the lake in a murder-suicide. Only Diane's body was recovered, but the lake was deep and the currents were strong. Everyone assumed Autumn's remains had been carried downstream. Francis had tried to push for a more thorough search, but by then, Evelyn was in her final days, and he'd been forced to choose between his family and a case that his superiors insisted was closed. He'd chosen his family, and the guilt of that choice had haunted him ever since. Now, standing in Willowbrook Cemetery with the very much alive Autumn Rivers, Francis realized that his instincts had been right all along. The case hadn't been solved, it had been buried. And somehow, this brave little girl had been surviving on her own for 2 years while the entire system that was supposed to protect her had written her off as dead. Luna had taken her mother's death hard, but she'd adapted with the resilience that children sometimes display in the face of unthinkable loss. Now 11, she was quiet and serious beyond her years, but still capable of joy when something truly delighted her. She'd thrown herself into reading, consuming entire series in days, and had developed a passion for astronomy that had dragging Francis to the local observatory every month. "Dad, do you think Mom can see the stars from where she is?"
Francis had struggled with how to answer. He wasn't sure what he believed about heaven or afterlife, but he'd learned that Luna needed hope more than philosophical uncertainty. "I think she can see everything that matters to her, especially you." Catherine had been pushing Francis to start dating again, introducing him to single mothers at Luna's school and arranging casual encounters with her bridge club friends' daughters. But Francis couldn't imagine loving someone the way he'd loved Evelyn. More than that, he couldn't imagine trusting someone else with Luna's heart. The house on Maple Street had become a shrine to Evelyn's memory. Her books still lined the shelves, her coffee mug still sat in the same spot in the kitchen cabinet, her clothes still hung in the closet because Francis couldn't bring himself to pack them away. Luna had gently suggested they might donate some things to charity, but Francis wasn't ready. Not yet. Work had become Francis's refuge from grief, even if he wasn't performing at his best. The Child Protective Services office was housed in a converted Victorian mansion downtown, its high ceilings and creaking floors giving it the atmosphere of a place where serious decisions were made. Francis's office was on the second floor, overlooking the town square where Millbrook Heights held its seasonal festivals and farmers markets. The town itself was one of those places that looked picture-perfect from the outside, but harbored secrets beneath its manicured surface. The Pemberton family had owned the largest manufacturing company in the area for 3 generations, employing nearly a quarter of the town's population. Their influence extended into city government, the school board, and even the police department through strategic donations and carefully placed family members. Francis had always known that some cases were more politically sensitive than others, but he'd never imagined that politics could reach into child welfare investigations. The Autumn Rivers case had been his first real glimpse into how power could corrupt even the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. Now, crouching in the cemetery with Autumn herself, Francis understood that he was being given a second chance. Not just to solve a case that had haunted him, but to rediscover the passion and purpose that had driven him before grief had numbed his heart. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, and Francis could hear low voices coordinating a search pattern. Whoever was hunting Autumn was organized and determined. This wasn't a casual search, it was a systematic manhunt. Francis looked at the frightened child beside him and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The man who had been sleepwalking through his professional responsibilities for 3 years was finally fully awake. And as the hunters closed in around them, Francis realized that this Christmas Eve was about to become the most important night of both their lives. The black sedan's engine cut through the cemetery silence like a blade, its occupants clearly conducting a methodical search. Francis pressed himself closer to the Victorian tomb, feeling Autumn's small body trembling against his side. Through the ornate stonework, he could see flashlight beams sweeping across the frozen ground, moving in coordinated patterns that spoke of professional training. "They do this every Christmas Eve," she whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "They know I come here to visit Mama, so they wait and watch." Francis felt his blood turn cold. "How long have you been running from them?" 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days, she replied with the precision of someone who had been counting every moment of her survival. "Ever since the night they killed Mama and made it look like suicide." The matter-of-fact way she spoke about murder made Francis's stomach clench. This child had been living with the knowledge of her mother's death and the constant threat of discovery for over 2 years. The psychological toll alone should have broken her, yet here she was, lucid and determined, planning her next move with the calculating mind of someone far older than her 12 years. "Autumn, I need you to tell me exactly what happened that night. Start from the beginning." She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Francis saw a depth of pain that reminded him of war veterans he'd known who carried invisible wounds. Mama had found something. Papers, recordings, proof of what they were doing. She said we had to run, that she was going to take everything to someone who could help. A flashlight beam swept dangerously close to their hiding spot, and both of them pressed deeper into the shadows. Francis could hear footsteps crunching through the frost, at least 3 sets, moving with military precision through the cemetery grounds. "What kind of proof?" Francis asked, when the immediate danger had passed. "The adoption ring," she said, her voice barely audible. "They were selling children, Mr. Francis, taking kids from foster care, faking their deaths or disappearances, then selling them to people who paid cash and didn't ask questions. Mama had worked as a cleaning lady at the Pemberton mansion, and she found files in Mr. Pemberton's private office." Francis felt the world tilt beneath him. The Pemberton family wasn't just influential in Millbrook Heights, they were practically royalty. William Pemberton III sat on the hospital board, the school committee, and personally funded the new children's wing at the community center. His wife, Victoria, chaired the annual charity gala that raised money for local foster programs. The idea that they could be involved in child trafficking seemed impossible, yet Francis had learned that the most respected facades often hid the darkest secrets. "How many children?" he asked, although he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer.
"At least 15 that Mama found records for. Maybe more." Autumn reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook, its pages worn from constant handling. "I've been keeping track, trying to remember everything Mama told me. Some of the kids were reported as runaways. Others supposedly died in accidents or were killed by mentally ill parents, just like they said happened to me." The systematic nature of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. Francis realized he was looking at a conspiracy that reached into every level of local government and social services. No wonder the Autumn Rivers case had been shut down so quickly. No wonder Detective Carlyle had been so eager to close it without a thorough investigation. "The night they came for us, Mama had hidden the evidence in 3 different places. She gave me this notebook and told me to memorize everything, just in case. She said if something happened to her, I should find someone I could trust and tell them the truth."
"Why didn't you come forward before now?" Francis asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Autumn's laugh was bitter and heartbreaking.
"Come forward to who? The police chief, Thomas Carlyle, is Detective Carlyle's brother. The mayor, Patricia Henley, is Victoria Pemberton's cousin. The head of Child Protective Services, well, let's just say Janet Rodriguez has a very nice house for someone who makes a government salary. Francis felt sick. His own supervisor was involved. That explained why his concerns about the Rivers case had been dismissed so quickly, why he'd been pressured to step back and let others handle the investigation. Janet had been protecting the conspiracy from the inside, making sure that anyone who got too close was redirected or discredited. The sound of a radio crackling nearby made them both freeze. A man's voice, low and professional, reported their search progress. Section 3 clear. Moving to Section 4. Subject may have fled through the back entrance. Francis recognized the voice immediately. Detective Raymond Carlyle, the man who had officially closed Autumn's case 2 years ago. The man who was supposed to be protecting children was actively hunting one through a cemetery on Christmas Eve. "We need to move," Francis whispered. "They're going to sweep this entire area." But Autumn shook her head firmly. "Not yet. I haven't finished talking to Mama." For a moment, Francis thought the stress had finally broken her, but then he understood. This wasn't about a conversation with the dead. It was about a promise. This child had been making this pilgrimage every Christmas Eve for 2 years, risking capture and death to honor her mother's memory and maintain the one connection she had left to her former life. "Autumn, your mother would want you to stay alive more than she'd want you to visit her grave." "You don't understand," Autumn said fiercely. "This isn't just about visiting. I leave messages here for people who might be able to help, other social workers, journalists, anyone who might believe me if something happens." Francis stared at her in amazement. This 12-year-old had created her own dead drop system, using her mother's grave as a communication point with potential allies. The implications were staggering. How many people in the system suspected something was wrong but couldn't speak openly? How many others were like Francis himself, carrying guilt about cases that didn't add up but lacking the courage or resources to investigate further? "Show me," Francis said. Autumn hesitated, clearly weighing whether she could trust him completely. Finally, she pointed to the base of her mother's headstone, where Francis could now see a small metal box partially hidden behind a decorative flower arrangement. "I check it every Christmas Eve and Easter. Sometimes there are notes, usually just from people saying they're sorry for my loss, but 3 times there have been messages from people who wanted to help." "What kind of messages?" "A nurse at the hospital who said she had seen children being brought in with fake ID papers. A teacher who noticed kids disappearing from the foster system and being replaced with different children using the same names. A truck driver who said he'd been paid to transport kids to a compound upstate, but didn't ask questions because the money was too good." Francis realized that Autumn had been conducting her own investigation for 2 years, gathering intelligence and building a case from the shadows. This 12-year-old had displayed more courage and determination than most of the adults in the system that was supposed to protect her. The flashlight beams were getting closer again, and Francis could hear Detective Carlyle coordinating with his team. "Bring the thermal scanner from the car. If she's hiding behind one of these monuments, we'll find her."
Thermal scanning technology. They weren't just conducting a casual search, they were using law enforcement resources to hunt a child. The corruption went deeper than Francis had imagined, extending into the very tools and systems that were meant to serve justice. "Autumn, we have to go now. They have equipment that could detect body heat through stone." But even as he spoke, Francis realized they were trapped. The cemetery only had 2 entrances, and both were likely being watched. The fence around the perimeter was too high to climb quickly, especially with a child, and the open ground between monuments would leave them exposed to anyone with night vision equipment. "There's another way out," Autumn said, reading his thoughts. "Mama and I found it when we used to visit Grandpa's grave before everything went wrong. There's a maintenance shed near the back fence that has a loose board. If we can get there without being seen." Francis looked at the distance they'd have to cover. It was maybe 200 yards, but it might as well have been 2 miles given the surveillance equipment their hunters were deploying. They'd need a distraction, something to draw attention away from their route to the shed. "I have an idea," Francis said, pulling out his cell phone. "But you have to promise me something. If we get separated, if something happens to me, you call this number." He showed her the contact information for Catherine Whitfield. "She's my mother-in-law, and she's someone you can trust completely. Tell her I sent you, and tell her everything you've told me." Autumn memorized the number with the same intense focus she'd shown while recounting her mother's murder. "What are you going to do?" Francis was already moving, staying low as he made his way toward the cemetery's main entrance. His plan was simple and desperate: create enough noise and confusion to draw the search team away from Autumn's escape route. It meant exposing himself, potentially ending his career and putting his own life at risk, but Francis had finally found something worth fighting for again. As he positioned himself behind a large memorial near the front gates, Francis thought about Luna sleeping safely at home, trusting that her father would return as he always did. He thought about Evelyn and the promise he'd made to always protect children who couldn't protect themselves. And he thought about Autumn Rivers, a 12-year-old girl who had shown more courage in 2 years than most adults displayed in a lifetime. The thermal scanner's electronic humming was getting closer. Francis took a deep breath, stepped out from cover, and triggered the motion-activated security lights that illuminated the cemetery's main entrance. The sudden blaze of light would blind anyone using night vision equipment and create the distraction Autumn needed. "Hey, Carlisle," Francis shouted into the night, "looking for someone?" The response was immediate and violent. Shouts erupted from multiple directions as the search team converged on his position. Francis heard the distinctive sound of weapons being drawn, and he realized that these weren't just corrupt local officials trying to cover up their crimes. These were people who were prepared to kill to protect their secret. As Francis raised his hands and stepped fully into the light, he prayed that Autumn was already running toward freedom, and that his sacrifice would give her the chance she needed to finally expose the truth that had been buried for too long. The hunt had become a battle, and Christmas Eve had transformed from a night of quiet remembrance into a moment that would determine whether justice could survive in a town built on lies. The blinding security lights created chaos among the search team, just as Francis had hoped. Through the glare, he could see Detective Carlisle barking orders into his radio, while 2 other figures scrambled to adjust their night vision equipment. Francis kept his hands raised, buying precious seconds for Autumn to reach the maintenance shed, but he could already hear boots pounding across the frozen ground as they closed in on his position. "Francis Moller," Detective Carlisle's voice carried a mixture of surprise and cold calculation as he emerged from behind a large mausoleum. "What brings Millbrook Heights' most dedicated social worker to a cemetery at midnight on Christmas Eve?" "Same thing that brings you here, Detective," Francis replied, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Looking for answers." Carlisle stepped closer, and Francis could see the man's face clearly now. The detective he'd worked with on dozens of cases over the years looked different in the harsh artificial light, harder, more dangerous, with the kind of predatory smile that Francis had learned to recognize in the worst kinds of child abusers. "Funny thing about smart people," Francis said, stalling for time while straining to hear any sound that might indicate Autumn had reached safety. "They tend to ask questions when children's lives are at stake."
Carlisle's laugh was cold and humorless. "Children's lives? Francis, you're standing in a cemetery talking about a girl who's been dead for 2 years. Maybe the stress of losing Evelyn has finally caught up with you. Maybe you're having a breakdown and need professional help." The threat was clear. If Francis pushed this further, his mental health would be called into question. His custody of Luna could be challenged, his career would be destroyed, and any testimony he might give would be dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken man who'd lost touch with reality.
Where's the thermal scanner, detective? Seems like overkill for chasing ghosts. One of the masked men whispered something to Carlyle, who nodded grimly. Francis realized they'd discovered something, probably evidence that Autumn had been at the cemetery. His distraction was working, but it might not be enough. Here's what's going to happen, Francis, Carlyle said, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. You're going to walk out of this cemetery, go home to your daughter, and forget you were ever here. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call in sick with the flu. Next week, you're going to request a transfer to a different department, maybe Parks and Recreation, something nice and quiet where you can't cause trouble. And if I refuse? Carlyle's smile widened. Well, cemetery accidents happen. Grieving widowers sometimes do desperate things around the holidays. The psychological evaluation reports practically write themselves. Francis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. He was looking at his own potential murder, planned and justified in advance by people who had clearly done this before. How many others had asked the wrong questions and ended up as tragic holiday statistics? A distant sound made all of them freeze, the metallic screech of a loose fence board being pried back into place. Autumn had reached the maintenance shed and was escaping through the back of the cemetery. But the sound had given away her location, and Francis could see the calculation in Carlyle's eyes. She's not as dead as you claimed, Francis said, no longer bothering to hide his knowledge. The pretense dropped from Carlyle's face like a discarded mask. Resourceful little thing, I'll give her that. 2 years of playing hide-and-seek. But games end eventually, Francis. And when we find her, and we will find her, there won't be any convenient accidents this time. One of the masked men was already moving toward the back of the cemetery, speaking rapidly into a throat microphone. Francis realized that Autumn's escape had only bought her minutes, not freedom. They would have vehicles stationed around the perimeter, backup teams ready to converge on any exit point. Why? Francis asked, genuinely confused by the scope of what he was witnessing. The Pembertons have more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Why risk everything for child trafficking? Carlyle studied Francis for a long moment, apparently deciding how much truth he could afford to reveal to a man he was planning to kill. You really don't understand how any of this works, do you? It's not about money, Francis. It's about power, control, the ability to provide certain services to certain people who have very specific needs and very deep pockets. The implications hit Francis like a physical blow. This wasn't just about selling children to families desperate for adoption. This was about providing children to predators, people whose desires were so dark that they required a steady supply of victims who couldn't be traced or identified. The compound upstate, Francis said, remembering Autumn's mention of the truck driver's message. That's where you take them. Very good. Yes, there's a facility about 3 hours north of here, completely private, very secure, catering to a very exclusive clientele. Politicians, judges, business leaders, people who understand that certain appetites require certain discretions. Francis felt sick, but he forced himself to keep listening. This information could be crucial if he somehow survived to testify. The beauty of the system, Carlyle continued, clearly enjoying Francis's revulsion, is that we only take children who won't be missed. Foster kids with behavioral problems, runaways with drug habits, orphans with mental health issues, society's throwaways. We give them purpose, Francis. We make them useful. You're talking about torture and murder. I'm talking about reality. These children were going to end up dead or damaged anyway. At least this way, their suffering serves a higher purpose, maintaining the stability and satisfaction of the people who actually matter in this world. He understood now why the conspiracy had been so successful for so long. It wasn't just corruption. It was a complete inversion of moral values, a system in which the most vulnerable members of society existed solely to satisfy the most depraved desires of the most powerful. His radio crackled with an update from the team pursuing Autumn. He couldn't make out the words, but Carlyle's expression darkened. The girl was still ahead of them, still free, still dangerous to their operation. "Time's up, Francis," Carlyle said, drawing his weapon. "I gave you a chance to walk away, but you know too much now. The good news is that your death will serve a purpose too. Grieving father, overwhelmed by holiday depression, takes his own life in the same cemetery where his wife is buried. Very poetic, very believable."
Francis looked at the gun pointed at his chest and thought about Luna, probably dreaming of Christmas morning presents while her father faced death in a frozen cemetery. He thought about Evelyn and the promise he'd made to always fight for children who couldn't fight for themselves. And he thought about Autumn Rivers, a 12-year-old girl who would spend 2 years living in the shadows, gathering evidence and waiting for someone brave enough to help her expose the truth. "There's just one problem with your plan, detective," Francis said, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. "And what's that?" Francis smiled, pulling his cell phone from his pocket and holding it up so Carlyle could see the screen. The recording app had been running for the past 10 minutes, capturing every word of the detective's confession. More importantly, the phone's emergency broadcast feature had been activated, sending the audio stream directly to the FBI's tip line and the state attorney general's office. "I'm a social worker, Carlyle. The first thing they teach us is how to gather evidence of abuse. And you just confessed to running a child trafficking ring on a live recording that's already been transmitted to federal authorities." The detective's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, rage, and finally a cold determination that Francis recognized as absolutely lethal. But before Carlyle could pull the trigger, the cemetery was flooded with new light as FBI vehicles burst through both entrances, their sirens wailing and their spotlights turning night into day. Francis had programmed the emergency broadcast system weeks ago, part of a safety protocol he developed after Evelyn's death, when he'd started taking more dangerous cases. He'd never expected to use it, but muscle memory and training had saved his life. Carlyle spun toward the approaching vehicles, his tactical discipline warring with panic. The masked men were already melting away into the darkness, abandoning their compromised operation with professional efficiency. But Carlyle hesitated for one fatal second, torn between escape and the desire to eliminate the witness who had just destroyed years of careful planning. That hesitation gave Francis the opening he needed. He dove behind the nearest headstone as gunfire erupted around him, praying that somewhere in the chaos, a 12-year-old girl named Autumn Rivers was finally, truly free. The battle for Millbrook Heights had begun, and Francis realized that Christmas Eve 2024 would be remembered not as a night of peace and celebration, but as the moment when the town's darkest secrets were finally dragged into the light. The gunfire lasted only 90 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Francis pressed himself against the cold marble of a 19th-century monument, listening to bullets ricocheting off stone angels and granite crosses, while FBI agents established a perimeter around the cemetery. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of radio communications and the distant wail of approaching sirens. "Francis Moller, this is Special Agent Victoria Nash, FBI. Are you injured?" Francis raised his head cautiously, seeing tactical lights cutting through the darkness as federal agents moved methodically through the cemetery. Detective Carlyle was nowhere to be seen, and Francis realized the corrupt officer had used the chaos to escape into the maze of monuments and mausoleums that filled the older section of Willowbrook Cemetery. "I'm here," Francis called back, slowly standing with his hands visible. "Carlyle's gone, but there were 2 other men with him. Military contractors, I think." Agent Nash approached, her weapon lowered but ready. She was a tall woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that Francis associated with people who had seen too much human cruelty. "Mr. Moller, we received your emergency transmission. Are you saying that Detective Raymond Carlyle of the Millbrook Heights Police Department just confessed to operating a child trafficking ring?" "Not just confessed. He detailed the entire operation. There's a compound 3 hours north of here where they take the children,
High-profile clients, political protection, the whole network. Francis felt exhaustion hitting him as the adrenaline began to fade. But Agent Nash, there's a 12-year-old girl named Autumn Rivers who's been running from these people for 2 years. She escaped during the confrontation, but they have teams searching for her. Agent Nash's expression hardened. Autumn Rivers was reported dead 2 years ago. Are you telling me she's been alive this entire time? Very much alive, and she has evidence, names, dates, documentation that her mother gathered before they killed her. Diane Rivers didn't commit suicide, Agent Nash. She was murdered for trying to expose this operation. The federal agent was already coordinating with her team, dispatching units to search the surrounding area for both Autumn and the escaped suspects. Francis watched the professional efficiency with a mixture of relief and growing worry. The FBI's arrival meant that the conspiracy could no longer be covered up locally, but it also meant that the people behind it would become increasingly desperate. Mr. Moller, I need you to come with us for debriefing. But first, is there anything else you can tell us about the girl's location or the scope of this operation? Francis thought about Autumn's notebook, her 2 years of careful documentation, her system of leaving messages at her mother's grave. She's been conducting her own investigation, gathering intelligence, building a case. She knows things that could bring down the entire network, which is why they're so determined to find her.
A younger agent approached with a tablet computer, showing Agent Nash what appeared to be surveillance footage. Ma'am, we've got movement on the thermal cameras. 3 vehicles leaving the area at high speed, and what looks like a child-sized heat signature moving through the woods behind the maintenance building. Francis felt a surge of hope. Autumn was still free, still ahead of her pursuers. But he also knew that her survival depended on staying hidden until the FBI could locate and protect her. Agent Nash, Francis said urgently, you need to understand something about this girl. She's been living on the streets for 2 years, trusting no one, staying alive through pure intelligence and determination. She's not going to just walk up to federal agents and surrender. She's going to assume that anyone in authority could be part of the conspiracy. The agent nodded grimly. How do we make contact? Francis thought about his brief conversation with Autumn, about the trust she'd shown him in those desperate moments behind the Victorian tomb. She knows who I am. She's been watching, gathering information about people in the system. If I could get a message to her, tell her that it's safe to come forward. Absolutely not, Agent Nash interrupted. You're not law enforcement, Mr. Moller. This is now an active federal investigation involving armed suspects who have already demonstrated willingness to kill. You've done enough. But even as she spoke, Francis could see the problem they were facing. Autumn had survived for 2 years by trusting no one in authority. The sudden appearance of federal agents, no matter how legitimate, would likely send her deeper underground. She would disappear again, taking her evidence with her, and the conspiracy would have time to destroy records and eliminate witnesses. Francis's phone buzzed with a text message. When he looked at the screen, his blood ran cold. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was unmistakably threatening. Tell your new friends to back off, or Luna joins the other children upstate. You have 1 hour. Agent Nash saw his expression and immediately took the phone. They have your daughter? Francis said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. They're threatening her, but she's at home with my mother-in-law. They'd have to break into the house, and Catherine's not exactly helpless. Even as he spoke, Francis was dialing Catherine's number. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, and his heart stopped. Catherine always answered her phone, especially late at night when she might be needed for an emergency. We need to get to my house, Francis said, already moving toward the cemetery entrance. Now. Agent Nash was coordinating with local FBI units, but Francis could hear the frustration in her voice as she tried to explain the jurisdictional complexities of a corruption case that involved local law enforcement. How do you ask the Millbrook Heights Police Department to provide backup when the detective running the department's major crimes unit was part of the conspiracy? The drive to Francis's house took 12 minutes that felt like hours. FBI vehicles surrounded the modest two-story home on Maple Street, their emergency lights painting the quiet neighborhood in ominous reds and blues. Francis could see neighbors peering out of windows, drawn by the unusual activity on their typically peaceful street. Agent Nash's radio crackled with updates as they approached. "All units, be advised. We have evidence of forced entry at the rear of the residence. 2 adult females, one approximately 70 years old, one approximately 11 years old, both missing. No signs of struggle inside the house." Francis felt the world tilt beneath him. Luna was gone. Catherine was gone. The one thing he'd sworn to protect above all else had been taken while he was playing hero in a cemetery. "Francis," Agent Nash's voice was gentler now, recognizing the devastation in his face. "We're going to find them, but I need you to focus. These people took your family to control you. That means they still need something from you." His phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "The girl for your family. Bring Autumn Rivers to the old Pemberton Mill at 3 a.m. Come alone or everyone dies." Francis stared at the message, understanding the impossible choice he was being forced to make. Save Autumn Rivers, the child whose evidence could expose a conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of lives, or save his own daughter and mother-in-law. Choose between justice and family. Choose between the greater good and personal love. "They want me to deliver Autumn Rivers to them," Francis said, showing Agent Nash the message, "in exchange for Luna and Catherine." "That's not happening," Agent Nash replied firmly. "We don't negotiate with terrorists and we don't sacrifice children to save other children. We find another way." But Francis was already thinking beyond the FBI's protocols and procedures. These people had taken his family because they understood exactly what kind of man he was. They knew he would sacrifice anything, including his own life, to protect Luna. They were counting on his love to override his principles. The question was whether Francis could find a way to save both Autumn and his family, or whether the conspiracy would force him to make the one choice he couldn't live with. As he stood in front of his violated home, surrounded by federal agents who promised protection they couldn't deliver, Francis realized that the next few hours would determine not just who lived and who died, but whether a man could maintain his moral center when the people he loved most were being used as weapons against him.
Agent Nash's radio erupted with urgent chatter as another FBI unit reported movement at the Pemberton mansion. Vehicles were arriving and departing under cover of darkness, suggesting that the conspiracy was mobilizing all its resources for what they clearly saw as a final confrontation. "Francis," Agent Nash said, studying the tactical information flowing in from her teams, "I know what you're thinking, but if you try to make this exchange, you'll be walking into a trap that will get everyone killed, including your daughter. We need to be smarter than they are." Francis looked at his watch. It was already past 1 a.m. In less than 2 hours, he would have to choose between everything he believed in and everyone he loved. And somewhere in the darkness, a 12-year-old girl named Autumn Rivers was running for her life, carrying secrets that could save other children or die with her in the frozen woods of Millbrook Heights. The cemetery had been just the beginning. The real battle was about to start. Francis stood in his ransacked living room, staring at the overturned furniture and scattered family photos, while Agent Nash coordinated search efforts through her earpiece. The house felt violated, stripped of the safety and warmth that had defined it since Evelyn's death. Luna's homework was still spread across the kitchen table, her math problems half finished, a glass of milk sitting beside her notebook with a thin film forming on the surface. They were taken approximately 45 minutes ago, Agent Nash reported after speaking with her forensics team. Professional extraction, minimal evidence left behind. These weren't amateurs, Francis. Your family was taken by people who have done this before.
Francis picked up one of Luna's drawings from the floor, a crayon sketch of their family standing in front of their house, including a stick figure of Evelyn with angel wings hovering protectively over them all. Her daughter's innocent faith that her mother was still watching over them felt like a mockery now. Where was that protection when Luna needed it most? His phone rang, the unknown number flashing on the screen again. Francis answered immediately, putting it on speaker so Agent Nash could hear. Francis. The voice was calm, cultured, unmistakably that of William Pemberton III. I trust you're beginning to understand the situation. Where are they? Francis kept his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. Safe, for now. Your daughter is quite remarkable, actually. Very brave, very protective of the elderly woman with her. She reminds me of another child who showed similar spirit. There was a pause that felt deliberately cruel. Before we broke that spirit, of course. Agent Nash was already signaling to her technical team, trying to trace the call, but Francis knew Pemberton was too smart to stay on the line long enough for a successful triangulation. What do you want? I think you know what I want, Francis. The Rivers girl has something that belongs to me. Information that could damage certain business relationships I've spent years cultivating. I want it back. She's a 12-year-old child, not a business asset. Pemberton's laugh was genuinely amused. Oh, Francis, you still don't understand, do you? Children are the ultimate business asset. They're renewable, replaceable, and they generate more profit per pound than cocaine or heroin. The Rivers girl represents a threat to a multi-million-dollar operation that serves some very important people. Francis felt sick hearing Luna's life discussed in the same terms as a drug transaction. If I bring you Autumn, you'll let my family go? I'll let them die quickly instead of slowly. That's the best deal you're going to get, and it's more mercy than I usually show to people who interfere with my business. The line went dead, leaving Francis staring at his phone, while Agent Nash cursed under her breath. Around them, FBI agents continued processing the crime scene, but Francis could see the frustration in their movements. They were dealing with a conspiracy that had decades of experience covering its tracks and eliminating threats. Francis, Agent Nash said carefully, I know what you're thinking. But you don't know anything, Francis interrupted. You don't have children, do you, Agent Nash? Because if you did, you'd understand there's no choice here. Luna is my daughter. She's the only family I have left. I'm not sacrificing her for anyone, not even to save other children. And what about Autumn Rivers? Are you willing to sacrifice her to save Luna? The question hit Francis like a physical blow, because it forced him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. Yes, he was willing to sacrifice Autumn. He was willing to hand a 12-year-old girl over to people who would torture and kill her if it meant saving his own daughter. The realization made him hate himself, but it didn't change his decision. Agent Nash's radio crackled with an update from the search teams. All units, we have a possible sighting of the subject approximately 2 miles north of the cemetery. Thermal imaging shows a child-sized figure moving through the woods near Thornton Lake. Thornton Lake. The same lake where Diane Rivers' body was found 2 years ago. I wondered if Autumn was drawn there by some need to be close to her mother, or if she was simply running out of places to hide. Agent Nash, Francis said quietly, I need you to understand something. In 3 hours, I'm going to walk into that mill and try to save my family. You can arrest me, you can try to stop me, but I'm going to do whatever it takes to get Luna back. And if Pemberton kills you all anyway? if this is just a trap to eliminate all the witnesses at once? Francis had considered that possibility. Pemberton had no reason to honor any deal, no incentive to let witnesses live. But Francis couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to save Luna, even if the attempt was futile. His phone buzzed with a text message, this time from a different number. When Francis read it, his heart nearly stopped. "Dad, they have me and Grandma Catherine. The man says if you don't bring the girl, he'll hurt us. I'm scared, but I love you. Luna." Agent Nash read the message over his shoulder. That could be fake. They could be forcing her to write that. "It's not fake," Francis said with absolute certainty. "Luna always signs her notes with just her name. But when she's really scared, when she needs me to know how much she loves me, she adds that last part. It's something she started doing after her mother died." The FBI agent studied Francis's face and seemed to recognize something there. The look of a parent who had just received proof that his child was in mortal danger. "Francis, if we can locate Autumn Rivers first, if we can get her to safety before the exchange—" "Then what? Pemberton kills my family out of spite?" "No, Agent Nash. The only way this ends with Luna alive is if I give him what he wants." But even as Francis spoke, he was thinking beyond the immediate crisis. Autumn had survived for 2 years by being smarter and more resourceful than her pursuers. She had evidence that could destroy the entire conspiracy, but only if she lived long enough to testify. There had to be a way to save both children, some strategy that didn't require choosing between justice and family. Agent Nash's phone rang, and she stepped away to take the call. When she returned, her expression was grim. "That was the Behavioral Analysis Unit. They've been reviewing the evidence you transmitted from the cemetery, and they have some insights about William Pemberton. Such as, he's a classic narcissistic psychopath with delusions of superiority, the kind of man who sees other people as objects to be used and discarded. But he also has one significant weakness, his ego. He needs to feel in control, needs to demonstrate his power over others." Francis didn't see how Pemberton's psychological profile helped save Luna and Catherine. "What's your point?" "My point is that men like Pemberton can't resist the opportunity to gloat, to explain how clever they've been, to humiliate their enemies before destroying them. If we can exploit that weakness—" Francis was already shaking his head. "You want to use my daughter as bait in some psychological manipulation game? Absolutely not. I want to give you and your family the best chance of survival, and that means understanding the kind of man we're dealing with." Francis's phone buzzed again, this time from a photo message that made his blood run cold. The image showed Luna and Catherine tied to chairs in what appeared to be a warehouse or industrial building. Luna's face was streaked with tears, but her expression showed the same determined courage that Francis had seen in Autumn Rivers. Even in terror, his daughter was trying to be brave. Below the photo was a message. "The clock is ticking, Francis. 3 a.m. at the mill. Bring the girl or join your family in the very unpleasant death." Agent Nash was studying the photo on her tablet, using image enhancement software to analyze the background. "I can see part of a logo on the wall behind them. Looks like industrial equipment, probably a manufacturing facility." "The old Pemberton textile mill," Francis said, recognizing the distinctive brick wall pattern. "It's been abandoned for 15 years, but the family still owns the property." Francis looked at his watch. 2:15 a.m. He had 45 minutes to find Autumn Rivers and convince her to walk into what was almost certainly a death trap. 45 minutes to figure out how to save 3 innocent lives without destroying his own soul in the process. Agent Nash was coordinating with tactical teams, planning some kind of rescue operation that Francis knew would fail. These people had been operating successfully for decades because they planned for contingencies. They had escape routes, backup plans, ways to eliminate the hostages if law enforcement got too close. The only way to save Luna was to give Pemberton what he wanted. And the only way to live with himself afterwards was to find some way to protect Autumn in the process. Francis walked out of his violated home into the cold December night, leaving Agent Nash calling his name behind him. He had less than an hour to find a 12-year-old girl who had spent 2 years learning to be invisible, convince her to trust him with her life, and walk into a trap that would test every principle he'd ever held about protecting children. The crisis had reached its breaking point, And Francis realized that some choices couldn't be made with logic or planning. Sometimes you had to trust that love and courage would be enough, even when every rational calculation said they wouldn't. Francis drove through the empty streets of Millbrook Heights with his headlights off, navigating by memory and the pale glow of street lamps. The FBI would be tracking his phone, so he'd left it on his kitchen counter with a note explaining his decision. Agent Nash would be furious, but Francis couldn't risk law enforcement interference disrupting his only chance to save Luna and Catherine.
He headed toward Thornton Lake, where the thermal imaging had detected Autumn's heat signature. The lake was a 15-minute drive from his house, surrounded by dense woods that would provide cover for a child trying to stay hidden. Francis parked at the old boat launch and stepped into the frigid night air, his breath forming clouds as he called out softly, "Autumn? It's Francis Moller. I need to talk to you." The woods remained silent, except for the whisper of wind through bare branches. Francis walked along the shoreline, his footsteps crunching through ice-crusted snow. This was where Diane Rivers had supposedly driven her car into the dark water, where the official story claimed both mother and daughter had died 2 years ago. "Autumn, I know you're here, and I know you're scared, but my daughter has been taken by the same people who killed your mother. I need your help." A small voice came from somewhere in the darkness above him. "They took your little girl?" Francis looked up and saw Autumn perched in the bare branches of an old oak tree, her red coat making her barely visible against the dark bark. She had chosen her hiding spot well, elevated enough to see anyone approaching, positioned near the water in case she needed to run in multiple directions. "Yes, Luna is 11 years old, and they're going to kill her unless I bring you to the old textile mill by 3 a.m. Autumn climbed down with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years living rough, landing silently on the frozen ground. In the moonlight, Francis could see that she looked even more fragile than she had in the cemetery, her face gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. "I'm sorry about your daughter," she said quietly, "but if I go with you, they'll kill all of us, including her." "Maybe, but if I don't bring you, they'll definitely kill Luna and Catherine. At least this way we have a chance." Autumn studied his face with those eerily mature eyes. "You're lying to yourself, Mr. Francis. There's no chance. Pemberton doesn't leave witnesses alive. The only reason I've survived this long is because I stay away from anyone he might use as leverage against me." The brutal honesty in her voice hit Francis like a slap. This child understood the situation better than he did, saw through his desperate rationalization to the truth beneath. Pemberton would kill them all, regardless of whether Francis cooperated. "Then help me find another way," Francis said. "You've been fighting these people for 2 years. You know things about their operation that nobody else knows. There has to be something we can use." Autumn was quiet for a long moment, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that belonged to someone much older. "There might be, but it's dangerous, and it might not work. Tell me." "Pemberton keeps records of everything. Names, dates, payments, photos, videos. He's paranoid about his business partners betraying him, so he maintains files on everyone involved in the operation. Insurance, he calls it." Francis felt a spark of hope. "Where does he keep these files?" "In a safe at his house. But that's not the important part. The important part is that he backs everything up to a server in his private office at the mill, the same mill where he's holding your family." Francis began to understand. If we could access that server, we could expose everyone involved in the conspiracy, every client, every facilitator, every corrupt official. The evidence would be so overwhelming that even Pemberton's political connections couldn't protect him. "But how do we get to the server? The mill will be crawling with his security team."
Autumn pulled out her worn notebook and showed Francis a hand-drawn map of the textile mill complex. "I've been studying this place for months. There's a maintenance tunnel system that connects all the buildings. I can get inside without being detected." Francis stared at the detailed blueprints. "You've been planning to break into the mill?" "I've been planning to destroy it," Autumn said matter-of-factly. "Burn the whole place down with Pemberton inside. But this might be better. If we can download the files and get them to the FBI, we can save more children than just ourselves." The plan was insane, but Francis could see the logic. While Pemberton's attention was focused on the exchange at the main entrance, Autumn could infiltrate the mill through the tunnel system and access the server room. If she could download the evidence and transmit it to law enforcement before the meeting concluded, they might have enough leverage to force Pemberton to release the hostages. "There's one problem," Francis said. "Even if you get the files, Pemberton won't just let us walk away. He'll kill us to buy himself time to escape." "That's where the FBI comes in," Autumn replied. "If I can transmit the evidence to them during our meeting, they'll have probable cause to raid the mill immediately. Pemberton won't have time to kill anyone before they break down the doors." Francis checked his watch. 2:35 a.m. They had 25 minutes to get to the mill and execute a plan that required perfect timing and more than a little luck. But it was better than walking blindly into a death trap. "Autumn, if this goes wrong—" "It won't go wrong," she interrupted with startling confidence. "I've been preparing for this moment for 2 years. I know exactly what I'm doing." Francis looked at this remarkable child and realized that she had been far more than just a survivor. She had been a strategist, a spy, a one-person resistance movement against a conspiracy that had destroyed countless lives. Her mother's death hadn't just been a tragedy. It had been the creation of an avenging angel.
"Why are you willing to risk this?" Francis asked. "You could disappear tonight, start over somewhere else. You don't owe me anything." Autumn's expression grew fierce. "Because I'm tired of running. Because other children are suffering while I hide in the shadows. Because my mama died trying to stop these monsters, and I'm going to finish what she started." Francis felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went beyond admiration or gratitude. This child embodied everything he had once believed about protecting the vulnerable, about fighting for justice regardless of personal cost. She was who he used to be, before grief had made him cautious and self-protective. "Okay," Francis said, "let's save my family and destroy William Pemberton." They spent the next 10 minutes refining their plan. Autumn would enter the mill through the tunnel system, while Francis approached the main entrance for the exchange. She would need approximately 15 minutes to reach the server room and download the files. Francis would have to keep Pemberton talking long enough for her to complete the data transfer and alert the FBI. "There's something else you need to know," Autumn said as they prepared to leave the lake. "Pemberton isn't just a businessman who got corrupted by money. He's a true believer. He genuinely thinks that children like us exist to serve people like him. He sees it as the natural order of things." "What's your point?" "My point is that he'll try to break you psychologically before he kills you. He'll want you to understand how powerless you are, how meaningless your resistance has been. Don't let him get inside your head." Francis nodded, but privately wondered if he had the strength to resist Pemberton's psychological games when Luna's life hung in the balance. The man who had confessed to operating a child trafficking ring with casual indifference would certainly know how to exploit a father's love for his daughter. As they drove toward the mill in Francis's car, Autumn stared out the window at the sleeping town of Millbrook Heights. After tonight, everyone will know the truth. The newspapers, the television stations, the internet. There won't be anywhere for these people to hide. "And then what happens to you?" Francis asked. Autumn was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I haven't thought past tonight. For 2 years, everything I've done has been about reaching this moment. After that," she shrugged, "maybe I'll finally get to be a regular kid." Francis pulled into the abandoned parking lot outside the textile mill.
its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls making it look like a monument to industrial decay. But he knew that inside, the building hummed with the kind of evil that turned children into commodities and transformed successful businessmen into monsters. "Autumn," Francis said, as she prepared to slip into the darkness. "Whatever happens in there, I want you to know that your mother would be proud of you." The 12-year-old girl who had survived 2 years on the streets and was about to infiltrate a criminal operation single-handedly looked back at Francis with eyes that held no trace of childhood innocence. "She's not proud, Mr. Francis. She's angry, and tonight her anger is going to burn this whole place to the ground." As Autumn disappeared into the shadows, Francis realized he was no longer the rescuer in the story. He was simply a father desperate to save his daughter, while a child half Luna's age prepared to bring down a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for years. The revelation hit him with stunning clarity. Autumn Rivers wasn't just a victim who needed saving. She was an instrument of justice who had been forged by tragedy into something far more dangerous than her enemies had ever imagined. Francis sat in his car outside the textile mill, watching the second hand of his dashboard clock crawl toward 3 a.m. The massive brick building loomed before him like a monument to industrial decay, its broken windows reflecting the pale moonlight in jagged fragments. Somewhere inside that structure, Luna and Catherine were waiting for rescue, while Autumn was crawling through maintenance tunnels toward what might be either salvation or death for all of them. The mill complex was larger than Francis had remembered from his childhood visits to Millbrook Heights' annual heritage festivals. The main building stretched nearly 3 city blocks, with smaller outbuildings connected by covered passages that had once protected workers from harsh weather. Now those same passages would provide Autumn with concealed routes to the server room where Pemberton stored his digital insurance files. Francis checked his phone one last time before getting out of the car. He had sent a detailed message to Agent Nash explaining our plan, along with the mill's address and a request for FBI units to stage nearby but remain out of sight until Autumn transmitted the evidence files. Whether Nash would trust his judgment or assume he'd lost his mind under pressure remained to be seen. The main entrance to the mill had been renovated despite the building's abandoned appearance. Heavy steel doors replaced the original wooden ones, and he could see the subtle glow of electronic security systems hidden among the shadows. This wasn't just Pemberton's meeting place. It was a fortress designed to keep secrets safe and eliminate problems permanently.
Francis approached the entrance slowly, his hands visible and empty as instructed. The doors opened before he could knock, revealing 2 men in tactical gear who immediately flanked him and conducted a thorough search for weapons or recording devices. They were professionals, efficient and silent, their faces hidden behind night vision goggles that gave them an insectoid appearance in the darkness. "Inside," one of them commanded, guiding Francis through a corridor that had been stripped of its original machinery and converted into something resembling a modern office complex. The walls were lined with soundproofing material, and Francis realized that no matter what happened inside this building, no one outside would hear it. The corridor opened into a vast manufacturing floor that had been transformed into something from Francis's worst nightmares. The space was divided into sections by hanging plastic sheets, each area containing different types of equipment that Francis recognized with growing horror. Medical examination tables, recording equipment, what appeared to be a small surgical suite, and holding cells that had been disguised to look like children's bedrooms, but featured locks on the outside of the doors. "Welcome to my primary facility," William Pemberton's voice echoed through speakers hidden throughout the space. "I'm sorry I can't greet you personally just yet, but I'm still dealing with some unexpected complications from your federal friends." Francis forced himself to look around the facility methodically, memorizing details that might be useful to law enforcement later, if there was a later. The scope of the operation was staggering. This wasn't just a meeting place or temporary holding facility, but a fully operational center for the kind of systematic abuse that had destroyed hundreds of children's lives. "Quite impressive, isn't it?" Pemberton continued, his voice carrying the pride of a businessman showing off his latest acquisition. 15 years of careful planning and investment. We can process up to 12 subjects simultaneously, with full medical monitoring and digital documentation. Our clients appreciate thoroughness. Francis felt bile rising in his throat, but forced himself to respond calmly. Where are Luna and Catherine? Safe and sound for the moment, but their continued safety depends entirely on your cooperation. Tell me, Francis, where is the Rivers girl? She's coming, but first I want to see my family. A section of the plastic sheeting was pulled aside, revealing Luna and Catherine bound to chairs in what had been staged to look like a comfortable waiting area. Both were alive and apparently unharmed, though Francis could see the terror in Luna's eyes and the protective fury in Catherine's expression. His mother-in-law had positioned herself as close to Luna as her restraints allowed, ready to shield the child with her own body if necessary. "Daddy!" Luna's voice carried across the space, filled with relief and hope that broke Francis's heart. She believed he was there to rescue her, trusted completely in his ability to make everything safe again. "I'm here, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay." But even as he spoke the words, Francis wondered if he was lying to his daughter for the last time. Autumn had been gone for nearly 20 minutes, and he had heard no indication that she had successfully accessed the server room or transmitted the evidence files to the FBI. Pemberton emerged from behind a partition, flanked by 4 armed men who moved with military precision. The businessman looked exactly as Francis remembered from newspaper photos and community events. Distinguished silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of getting everything he wanted. Only his eyes betrayed the monster beneath the respectable facade, cold and calculating, as they assessed Francis like a predator evaluating prey. "You seem nervous, Francis. Perhaps you're having second thoughts about our arrangement." "I brought myself here as promised. Now let my family go and we can discuss Autumn's location." Pemberton's smile was genuinely amused. "Oh, Francis, you still think this is a negotiation. You still believe you have some kind of leverage in this situation." He gestured to his armed security team. "The only reason you're still breathing is because I want to understand how a small-town social worker managed to cause so much trouble for my operation." Francis realized that Pemberton had never intended to honor any agreement. The businessman was simply enjoying the process of demonstrating his complete control over the situation before eliminating all the witnesses. This was psychological torture disguised as a business transaction. "The truth is," Pemberton continued, "I've been dealing with complications all evening. Federal agents crawling all over the cemetery, asking questions about Detective Carlisle's whereabouts, generally making nuisances of themselves. But I'm confident we can contain the situation." Francis felt his heart sink. If the FBI was already investigating, if they knew about Carlisle's involvement, then Autumn's evidence files might be redundant. The careful plan they had developed might be unnecessary, leaving her trapped in the mill's tunnel system for nothing. "You look disappointed," Pemberton observed. "Were you perhaps counting on some kind of dramatic rescue, some last-minute intervention from your federal friends?"
Francis said nothing, but his expression must have given him away, because Pemberton's smile widened with genuine delight. "Francis, let me share something that might clarify your situation. The FBI investigation you're so proud of triggering? It's being handled by Special Agent Victoria Nash, who happens to be the daughter of Judge Patricia Nash. Judge Nash, in turn, happens to be one of my oldest and most valued clients." The revelation hit Francis like a physical blow. Agent Nash hadn't been investigating the conspiracy. She had been monitoring the investigation for Pemberton. Every piece of information Francis had shared, every strategy the FBI had developed, had been reported directly to the people they were trying to stop. You see, Francis, the beauty of my operation isn't just its profitability. It's the way it creates unbreakable bonds between very powerful people. When a federal judge has been enjoying my services for 15 years, she tends to be very motivated to protect those services from interference. Francis thought about Agent Nash's behavior throughout the evening, her reluctance to move aggressively, her insistence on following procedures that gave the conspiracy time to respond, her technical team's inability to trace phone calls or locate the mill despite having Francis's exact location. She hadn't been trying to solve the case. She had been managing it. "Where is the Rivers girl, Francis?" Francis looked across the factory floor at Luna and Catherine, then at the armed men surrounding him, then at William Pemberton's expectant face. Autumn had been underground for nearly 30 minutes with no communication. Either her plan had failed completely, or she was still working her way through the tunnel system toward the server room. "She's scared," Francis said, buying time. "It took me 2 hours to convince her to consider coming here. She's seen what you people do to children who trust the wrong adults." "Yes, she has quite a survival instinct, much stronger than her mother's, unfortunately. Diane Rivers thought she could expose my operation through conventional channels, police reports, social services, the local newspaper. She never understood that all those channels lead back to me." Pemberton began walking slowly around Francis, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. "The Rivers woman gathered evidence for months. Documents, photographs, financial records. She thought she was building a case that would bring down my entire network. What she was actually doing was identifying the exact scope of my operations for me, helping me understand which security measures needed improvement." Francis realized that Diane Rivers had made the same mistake he and Autumn were making now, assuming that evidence and truth would be enough to overcome corruption and power. But Pemberton's network wasn't just about money or influence. It was about mutual assured destruction. Every client, every facilitator, every corrupt official was trapped in a web of shared guilt that made exposure impossible without destroying themselves. The funny thing about evidence, Francis, is that it only matters if someone with authority is willing to act on it. When everyone with authority is either bought, blackmailed, or compromised, evidence becomes nothing more than interesting reading material. Francis checked his watch. 3:20 a.m. If Autumn was going to successfully download and transmit the files, she needed to do it soon. But more importantly, if her plan was going to work, she needed to trigger the FBI response before Pemberton lost patience with his psychological games and decided to end the evening permanently. "Where is the Rivers girl, Francis?" Francis looked across the factory floor at Luna and Catherine, then at the armed men surrounding him, then at William Pemberton's expectant face. Autumn had been underground for nearly 30 minutes with no communication. Either her plan had failed completely, or she was still working her way through the tunnel system toward the server room. "She's scared," Francis said. "She's already here. She's been inside your mill for the past 30 minutes, downloading every file from your server and transmitting them to law enforcement agencies across the country." Pemberton's confident expression flickered for just a moment, revealing the first crack in his psychological armor. "That's impossible. This facility has the most advanced security systems available." "Advanced enough to stop a 12-year-old girl who spent 2 years learning to be invisible? A child who knows every maintenance tunnel, every blind spot, every weakness in your fortress?" For the first time since Francis had arrived, William Pemberton looked genuinely uncertain. And in that moment of doubt, Francis heard the most beautiful sound of his life, the distant wail of sirens approaching the mill from multiple directions. Autumn Rivers had done it. The evidence was out, the cavalry was coming, and the conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades was about to face the consequences of its crimes. The sirens grew louder as William Pemberton's face transformed from confident superiority to cold rage. His mask of civilized businessman dropped completely, revealing the predator who had spent decades turning children into commodities. The armed men around the factory floor tensed, their weapons trained on Francis, while their leader decided whether to cut his losses or fight to the end. "Impossible," he snarled, pulling out a tablet computer and frantically accessing the mill's security system. "The tunnels are monitored, motion sensors, thermal imaging, pressure plates. Nothing gets through without triggering alarms."
Francis watched Pemberton's growing panic with grim satisfaction. You built your security system to keep out adults, not children. Autumn weighs 80 pounds and knows how to move like a ghost. She's been studying this place for months while you thought she was just another runaway hiding in the woods. The tablet in Pemberton's hands showed cascading security alerts as FBI tactical teams surrounded the mill complex. Francis could see multiple breach points being identified, with federal agents coordinating their assault from positions that suggested they had complete intelligence about the building's layout. Autumn hadn't just downloaded files. She had provided the FBI with detailed architectural plans and security protocols. "Sir," one of Pemberton's security team called out, "we have federal vehicles at all exits. They're demanding immediate surrender and threatening to breach if we don't comply." Pemberton's calculating mind was clearly weighing options, but Francis could see the businessman reaching the same conclusion that Detective Carlyle had faced in the cemetery. The conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades was finally cornered, and the choice was between surrender and a violent last stand that would only delay the inevitable. "How much did she get?" Pemberton demanded, still scrolling through security feeds that showed his facility being surrounded by law enforcement. "Everything," Francis replied. "Client lists, financial records, video files, correspondence with corrupt officials. 20 years of evidence that you kept as insurance against your business partners. Autumn turned your own paranoia against you." A new voice echoed through the factory floor, amplified by FBI megaphones positioned outside the building. "William Pemberton, this is Assistant Director Sarah Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are surrounded and have no means of escape. Release the hostages immediately and surrender yourself for arrest." Francis recognized the name from his brief research into federal child trafficking investigations. Assistant Director Chen had spent her career prosecuting cases exactly like this one, and her presence meant that the FBI was taking the situation seriously enough to deploy their most experienced personnel. Pemberton was studying the tablet with the intensity of a general reviewing battlefield intelligence. "The server room shows no unauthorized access. If the girl had reached the files, there would be digital footprints, system logs showing data transfer." Francis felt a moment of doubt. Had Autumn's mission failed? Were the FBI agents surrounding the mill responding to his earlier messages rather than transmitted evidence? If Autumn hadn't successfully downloaded the files, then this confrontation was just a desperate bluff that would end with all of them dead. But then Francis remembered the methodical way Autumn had planned every detail of their operation. Her 2 years of careful preparation, her intimate knowledge of the mill's systems. She wasn't just a frightened child improvising a rescue attempt. She was a strategic genius who had been preparing for this moment since her mother's murder. "Check the backup systems," Francis suggested. "She didn't access your primary server, did she? She went after the redundant storage that you probably forgot was even there." Pemberton's face went pale as he accessed different screens on his tablet. The mill's backup power systems, environmental controls, and emergency communications all ran on separate networks that maintained their own data storage for operational continuity.
A child crawling through maintenance tunnels wouldn't have access to the main server room, but she would have direct physical access to backup systems that most people never considered. "The environmental control server," Pemberton whispered, his voice carrying the tone of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. She accessed the HVAC system's backup storage. That server mirrors everything from the main system for energy management purposes. I allowed myself a moment of fierce pride in Autumn's ingenuity. While Pemberton had been protecting his primary systems with military-grade security, he had overlooked the mundane backup systems that a resourceful child could access through utility spaces that weren't designed to exclude small, determined intruders. The factory floor erupted in coordinated motion as Pemberton's security team prepared for a siege. Men took positions behind machinery and structural supports, while others began destroying computer equipment and paper files. Francis realized they were implementing a scorched earth protocol, eliminating as much evidence as possible before federal agents could secure it. "Sir," one of the armed men called out, "we have federal vehicles at all exits. They're demanding immediate surrender and threatening to breach if we don't comply." "No," Francis said firmly, stepping toward Pemberton, even though the weapons were pointed at him. "This is over, Pemberton. Your files are already in federal hands, your network is compromised, and every law enforcement agency in the country knows what you've been doing."
Pemberton's laugh was bitter and desperate. "You think this ends with my arrest? You think destroying one facility shuts down an operation that spans multiple states and involves hundreds of clients? I'm just one node in a network that's been operating since before you were born, Francis." The megaphone outside crackled with another announcement. "Mr. Pemberton, you have 60 seconds to release the hostages and surrender. Federal agents are prepared to enter the building with or without your cooperation." Francis could hear the sounds of tactical teams positioning themselves at multiple entry points. Flashbang grenades would follow, then armed agents moving through the factory floor while trying to locate and protect hostages in a complex environment filled with armed resistance. "Luna," Francis called across the factory floor, "I need you to be very brave for just a little bit longer. Close your eyes and cover your ears when I tell you to, okay?" His daughter's voice came back strong and clear despite her obvious terror. "I love you, Daddy." The simple declaration hit Francis like a physical blow, reminding him of everything he stood to lose in the next few minutes. But it also reminded him of everything he was fighting to protect. Not just his own daughter, but every child who had suffered in facilities like this one. Pemberton was issuing rapid orders to his security team, preparing to use Luna and Catherine as bargaining chips in a negotiation that Francis knew would end badly for everyone involved. Desperate criminals holding hostages rarely made rational decisions, and federal agents trained for these situations understood that sometimes rescue required accepting acceptable casualties. That's when Francis heard the most unexpected sound of the entire night. A 12-year-old girl's voice coming through the factory's public address system. "Mr. Pemberton, this is Autumn Rivers. I want you to know that I didn't just download your files. I've been uploading them to every news organization, every social media platform, and every law enforcement database I could access for the past 40 minutes. Francis saw Pemberton's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of exhausted resignation as he realized the full scope of what had just happened to his carefully protected empire. The names of every client, every facilitator, every corrupt official are now public record, Autumn continued, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed to freeze everyone in the factory. Judge Patricia Nash, Detective Raymond Carlisle, Mayor Patricia Henley, and 47 others whose communications I found in your server. They're all being arrested simultaneously as we speak. Pemberton sank into a chair,
the tablet falling from his nerveless fingers as he understood that his network of mutual protection had just collapsed entirely. Without corrupt officials to shield them, without judges to dismiss cases and police to lose evidence, the entire conspiracy was vulnerable to prosecution. But most importantly, Autumn's voice continued, I want the families of the children who died because of your business to know that justice is finally coming. Sarah Martinez, Tommy Chen, Rebecca Williams, and 31 others whose names I found in your files. They didn't die in accidents or run away from home. They were murdered by your clients, and now the world knows the truth. Francis realized that Autumn had done more than just expose a criminal conspiracy. She had given names and dignity back to victims who had been erased from official records, whose deaths had been covered up as accidents or disappearances. She had ensured that their families would finally know what had happened and who was responsible. The megaphone outside announced the final warning. All occupants of the mill, you have 10 seconds to surrender before federal agents enter the building. Pemberton looked around at his armed security team, at the hostages who were no longer valuable as bargaining chips, at the empire he had built over decades that was crumbling in real time. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow tone of a man who had finally run out of options. Stand down, he told his men. Release the hostages and surrender your weapons. It's over. As Francis ran toward Luna and Catherine, cutting their restraints with shaking hands while FBI agents poured through the factory entrances, Francis realized that Christmas Eve had become something more than just a night of crisis and survival. It had become the moment when a 12-year-old girl's courage had finally brought justice to victims who had been forgotten by everyone except the people who loved them. The nightmare was ending, but Francis knew that the healing would take much longer to complete. 6 months after the Christmas Eve that changed everything, Francis stood in the kitchen of their house on Maple Street, watching through the window as Luna and Autumn worked together in the garden that Catherine had helped them plant. The spring sunshine fell across their faces as they carefully tended the vegetable seedlings, Luna explaining the difference between tomato and pepper plants, while Autumn listened with the intense focus she brought to everything involving normal childhood experiences. The house felt different now, fuller somehow. Though the changes were subtle, Autumn's drawings hung on the refrigerator next to Luna's. Her library books were scattered across the coffee table, and her small backpack sat by the front door alongside Luna's school bag. The guest room that had once been Francis's office was now officially Autumn's bedroom, painted a soft green that she had chosen after spending 20 minutes staring at color samples with the wonder of someone who had never been asked to make such a decision.
The legal process of Autumn's adoption had been surprisingly straightforward, with no living relatives willing to come forward after the publicity surrounding the Pemberton case, and with Francis already approved as a foster parent through his work with Child Protective Services. The state had been eager to place her in a stable home. Judge Richardson, who had replaced the arrested Judge Nash, had expedited the paperwork with unusual speed, perhaps motivated by the media attention surrounding the case. She's remarkably resilient, Dr. Patricia Reeves had told Francis during one of Autumn's therapy sessions. The trauma is certainly there, but she's developed extraordinary coping mechanisms. Her intelligence and determination have probably saved her life multiple times, but they've also helped her process experiences that would break most adults. The therapist had been working with both girls, helping Luna understand the complexities of their expanded family while supporting Autumn's transition from survival mode to something resembling normal childhood. The process hadn't been without challenges. Autumn still woke up screaming sometimes, reliving memories that no child should carry. She hoarded food in her bedroom until Francis gently explained that meals would always be available. She flinched when adults moved too quickly or spoke too loudly, and she watched every room's exits with the automatic awareness of someone who had spent years ready to run. But there had been breakthrough moments too. The first time Autumn laughed at one of Luna's silly jokes, The morning Francis found her curled up on the couch reading a book instead of monitoring the street through the front window. The afternoon she tentatively asked if she could call him Dad like Luna did, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the word itself might be too dangerous to speak aloud. Catherine had embraced her role as grandmother to both girls with characteristic enthusiasm. She had emerged from her kidnapping ordeal with nothing more serious than bruised wrists and a fierce protective instinct toward Autumn that rivaled Francis's own. The three of them formed an unlikely family unit that somehow worked despite its unconventional origins. "Francis," Catherine called from the living room where she was helping Luna with her math homework, "there's something on the news about the Pemberton trial." Francis joined them in front of the television, where a reporter was standing outside the federal courthouse in Chicago. The Pemberton case had been moved there after it became clear that no local venue could provide an impartial jury pool. The story had dominated national news for months, sparking congressional hearings and prompting federal legislation to strengthen oversight of child welfare systems. William Pemberton III was sentenced today to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The federal judge called his crimes a systematic assault on the most vulnerable members of our society, and noted that the evidence presented during the trial revealed a conspiracy that operated across multiple states for more than 2 decades. Francis felt a profound sense of closure watching Pemberton being led away in handcuffs. The man who turned children into commodities would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary, his empire destroyed and his name synonymous with the worst kind of human evil. 47 co-conspirators have been convicted in related trials, including Judge Patricia Nash, who received a 20-year sentence for obstruction of justice and conspiracy charges. Detective Raymond Carlisle remains at large and is considered armed and extremely dangerous. Carlisle's escape still haunted Francis. The corrupt detective had vanished during the cemetery confrontation and hadn't been seen since. FBI analysts believed he had fled the country, possibly to a nation without extradition treaties, but his continued freedom felt like unfinished business. The news report shifted to a follow-up story about the impact of Autumn's revelations. The evidence provided by the key witness in this case has led to the recovery of 43 missing children and the identification of over 200 victims dating back to 1998. Many families who had lost hope of ever learning what happened to their children now have answers, though not all of those answers provide closure. Francis thought about the families who had received confirmation that their missing children were dead, killed by clients of Pemberton's network years or even decades ago. For them, Autumn's courage had brought truth, but not reunion, justice, but not healing. "There's something else," the reporter continued. "The witness, whose identity has been protected due to her age, has established a foundation to support other children who have survived trafficking situations. The Diane Rivers Foundation for Child Protection has already provided assistance to over 100 families across the country." Francis looked at Autumn in surprise. She hadn't mentioned establishing a foundation, though he probably shouldn't have been shocked. This was the same child who had spent 2 years conducting her own investigation and had single-handedly brought down a multi-state conspiracy. "When did you—"
"Last month," Autumn said quietly. "There's money from the Victim Compensation Fund, and some of the families whose children were found because of the evidence wanted to contribute. I thought Mama would want me to help other kids, like I was helped." Luna beamed at her adopted sister with obvious pride. "Autumn's going to be famous for helping people, instead of being famous for being hurt." The simple wisdom in Luna's observations struck Francis powerfully. Autumn was transforming her trauma into purpose, using her experience to protect others who found themselves in similar situations. She was becoming exactly the kind of advocate that Francis had once been, before grief had made him cautious and self-protective. The foundation is also funding research into improved protocols for investigating missing children cases, the reporter added, with particular focus on identifying corruption within local law enforcement and social services. Francis realized that Autumn was systematically addressing every weakness that had allowed the Pemberton network to operate successfully. She was ensuring that future investigators would have better tools, that corrupt officials would be easier to identify, that missing children wouldn't be written off as quickly as she had been. The news report concluded with an update on the other survivors. Most were receiving intensive therapy and support, slowly rebuilding lives that had been interrupted by years of unimaginable trauma. Some had been reunited with family members they hadn't seen in years. Others, like Autumn, had been placed with new families who could provide the stability and love they needed to heal. That evening, as Francis tucked both girls into bed, Autumn asked him a question that had become part of their nightly routine. "Dad, do you think Mama knows what happened? Do you think she knows that the bad people got punished?" Francis had struggled with how to answer this question when Autumn first started asking it. He wasn't sure what he believed about death and consciousness, about whether love could transcend the boundaries between life and whatever came after. But he had learned that Autumn needed hope more than theological certainty. "I think she knows," Francis said, sitting on the edge of Autumn's bed. "I think she's proud of how brave you were, how you never gave up, how you turned something terrible into something that helps other people. Do you think she's happy that I have a new family?" Francis thought about Evelyn, about how she would have loved this remarkable child who had brought purpose and meaning back into their lives. "I think both of our mothers are happy that we found each other. Sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, not the ones we're born into." Autumn smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that still amazed Francis. When she smiled, really smiled, she looked like exactly what she was, a 13-year-old girl who loved astronomy novels and mystery novels, who helped her younger sister with homework and worried about pop quizzes in English class. Later that night, Francis stood on the back porch with Catherine, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The spring air was warm and sweet with the scent of the flowering trees that line their street, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell was chiming the hour. "She is going to be something special," Catherine said, following Francis's gaze toward Autumn's bedroom window, where a soft light indicated she was probably reading before sleep. "She already is something special. She always was. We just had to create a space safe enough for her to show it." Catherine nodded and then asked the question that Francis had been expecting for months. "What about you? Are you going to be okay with all this attention? All these reporters wanting to interview the family that adopted the girl who brought down the trafficking ring?" Francis had been wondering the same thing. The media attention had been intense, but generally respectful, focusing on Autumn's courage rather than sensationalizing her trauma. Still, he worried about the impact on both girls, about whether growing up in the public eye would create new challenges for children who had already faced more than their share of difficulties. "We'll figure it out," Francis said finally. "We'll protect their privacy as much as possible, and we'll make sure they know they can choose how much of their story to share and when." What Francis didn't say, but what Catherine probably understood, was that he was proud of the story they were sharing. Proud of Autumn's courage and determination, proud of Luna's open heart and generous spirit, proud of their family's ability to transform trauma into healing. The house on Maple Street had been a place of grief and careful routine when Francis lived there alone with Luna. Now it was something entirely different, a sanctuary where broken people could heal, where love could grow in unexpected places, where two girls could learn that family was about choice and commitment rather than just biology. As Francis locked the doors and turned off the lights, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Christmas Eve had begun as another painful anniversary, another reminder of loss and loneliness. It had become the night when everything changed, when a frightened man learned to be brave again, and a traumatized child learned to trust again.
The cemetery where it all started remained a place Francis visited regularly, though now he brought both girls with him. They would place flowers on Evelyn's grave, while Autumn left small tokens at her mother's headstone nearby. The sacred ritual of remembrance had become a family tradition that honored both the dead and the living. In his bedroom, Francis found a note on his pillow in Autumn's careful handwriting. "Thank you for believing me.
Thank you for helping me save other kids. Thank you for being the dad I never thought I'd have. Love, Autumn. Francis sat on the edge of his bed holding the note, understanding that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain or the erasure of trauma, but the transformation of suffering into purpose, the creation of new love from the ashes of old loss. Outside his window, Millbrook Heights slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, no longer harboring the secrets that had made it a place of danger for vulnerable children. The town's character had been forever changed by the revelation of the conspiracy that had operated in its shadows, but it was slowly rebuilding its reputation as a place where families could grow and children could be safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to protect and serve others who needed help. But tonight, Francis could rest in the knowledge that his family was complete, his daughters were safe, and justice had finally been served to those who preyed on the innocent. The mystery that had begun in a cemetery on Christmas Eve had ended with the creation of something beautiful, a family bound not by tragedy, but by love. Not by the past, but by hope for the future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.